Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jenny Pearson. I'm an Education Officer for the Primary Health Network. Welcome to our webinar today. This webinar is being recorded and will be available in our library. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to type them into the question box and we will answer them at the end of the webinar. I will now hand over to Ellen Senft, who is our Disaster Coordinator. Thanks, Ellen.
Thank you. I'm just sharing my screen. Sorry for that glitch. There it is. Wonderful. So good afternoon, everyone. Nice to see you and welcome to our webinar today for the webinar Person-Centered and Organizational Emergency Preparedness. It's a webinar for primary care providers, aged care and NDIS providers. My name's Ellen Senft. I'm the Manager Disaster and Emergency Coordination at the Primary Health Network. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands we are all on together and pay my respects to elders past and present. The Hunter New England and Central Coast Primary Health Network acknowledges the country and the traditional custodians of the lands that form our region, the ancestors and elders past and present. We acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as Australia's First Nations and recognise that these lands were never ceded. The PHN recognises their unique cultural and spiritual relationships to the land, waters and seas. We acknowledge their rich contribution to society and the traditional knowledge First Nations Australians have to offer to us and to our future generations to be the turning point of reconnecting humanity with land and culture again. I would also extend this acknowledgement to all First Nations people in the webinar today. Thank you. So we will cover many topics today. We will talk about the role of primary care providers and care organizations in compiling person-centered emergency plans, how the PSEP toolkit can assist providers in delivering capability-based individual emergency planning to their patients and clients, how to put disability inclusion into practice by following the easy-to-use framework for disability-inclusive disaster risk reduction, and we will also talk about how to assess and develop organizational emergency preparedness. Why is person-centered emergency preparedness important? So I just picked this example with the new aged care standards that will come into effect this July. The new aged care standards will come into effect in July, and I mean there are other frameworks for NDIS providers that have similar contents, but I have been looking at the new standards, and this is just a short summary outlining the individual standards that incorporate some elements of person-centered care and emergency preparedness. Recently, a guidance material for the new strengthened standards has been released as well, and that tool outlines the expected outcomes for each standard. As you see, they come and pop up. There are many standards that align with PSEP, and the concept of PSEP and disability inclusive disaster risk reduction will assist you providers to navigate through the requirements of these new standards to reach the desired outcomes. You will find a similar alignment in the NDIS practice standards, and primary care providers, including general practitioners, are an important stakeholder in developing chronic disease management plans that empower patients and aged care clients to make their own informed decisions about how to manage their health during an emergency and a disaster. So we are all very important stakeholders that need to work towards making disaster and emergency preparedness more inclusive. For everyone who's interested in those guidance and outcomes documents, they are available in the link. You will receive these slides after the webinar, and then you can click through it. One really important aspect is also don't forget to practice your organization's emergency plan and the individual client's plan to ensure that it is practicable and to test if there are any improvements necessary. Whenever a plan needed to be activated in a real-time event, then afterwards, please perform a debrief with your organization or the client, and if applicable, also include their family to ensure that the lessons learned during an event are incorporated to make the response and the recovery easier next time the client or your organization has to go through a disaster again. And last but not least, if you like to hear more about the topic of emergency planning, come and join us for a PHN interactive webinar on May 15th and May 22nd. It's a webinar conducted by first responding agencies. We have the SES, RFS, LHD, and Reconstruction Authority on board. And we will also have local care providers presenting on their lessons learned. And there will be a complex desktop scenario we will walk you through. So I will now hand over to Professor Michelle Villeneuve, who's the Deputy Director at the University of Sydney Impact Centre for Disability Research and Policy. Michelle will introduce you to the concepts of person-centered emergency preparedness, disability inclusive disaster risk reduction, and organizational emergency preparedness. Thank you. I'm handing over now.
Thanks so much, Ellen. I'm going to just share my slides and assume that you can see me, but I can't see you. I'd like to start by saying that I'm working on Gadigal land, and I want to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and recognize that the research we do around inclusive disaster risk reduction actually happens across many First Nations communities across Australia. Today, what I'm going to do is focus on the person-centered emergency preparedness toolkit and make the case for everybody needing a plan. So I really appreciated that Ellen has introduced the aged care standards. And those of you in the NDIS sector will know that there's also standards of practice for disability sector providers as well. But I also want to make a case that you personally need a plan. And what I hope that you'll come away with today is a spark for a person-centered conversation, perhaps that will continue, or maybe start around the dinner table tonight with friends and family, and then continue with other conversations at the water cooler with your colleagues, and then starting to think about how that embeds itself into your programs and practices. Everyone needs a plan, and that means individuals, organizations, and communities. And inclusive disaster risk reduction, I think I should probably just first get this acronym out of the way. Disability inclusive disaster risk reduction means making sure that the rights of people with disability to safety, protection, and inclusion at all stages of disaster risk management. Too often, we've waited until disasters happen or in the recovery phase to recognize the disproportionate risks that people with disability and other people with functional support needs experience in emergencies. And our program of work has been focused heavily on shifting to pre-planning and preparedness long before a disaster strikes. Our research began here in Australia in 2015, but before that in Indonesia, and brought some of our lessons from the Indonesian context to here. The primary research question we ask is, how do we enable people with disability to take control of their own emergency preparedness while also ensuring that their rights to protection and safety are met? In 2015, we had DIDR principles: accessibility, participation, collaboration, non-discrimination, which is a bit of a mouthful, but no real practical instruments to translate those principles into very practical actions that people could take. So this was effectively a barrier for everyone to ensuring the rights to protection and safety for people with disability in emergencies. By 2021, we had the new Australia's Disability Strategy, which for the first time included disability inclusive emergency management and an outcomes framework. We had the NDIS practice standards and legislative amendment requiring emergency planning for the disability sector. And now, as Ellen mentioned, in July, the new aged care standards will come into effect. But these requirements sit in a broader context of action on inclusive emergency management. So just to put this into perspective, thinking about the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, which is our international treaty to ensure the rights and protections of people with disability. Among other articles, Article 11 specifically focuses on the rights and protection and safety in times of emergency. The Sendai framework is an international framework for disaster risk reduction. It tends to focus on understanding risk and having the tools to prepare for emergencies. And in 2015, the Sendai framework for the first time included people with disability as legitimate stakeholders in the process. So I think we should all actually digest that and sometimes be a bit alarmed that it's taken until 2015 for our emergency stakeholders and sector colleagues to sort of realize those risks for people with disability. Over the course of the last decade here in Australia, we've been working in partnership with government, emergency services, the disability, health and community sectors, and with people with disability, their advocates and allies to build the tools and influence policy. And so what you have on the slide there is really just a sample of the impact that has been making in policy and practices across Australia. And on the far right of the screen, I've just highlighted the New South Wales, because that's where we are today, state disaster mitigation plan, which includes our DIDR framework and person-centered approaches to disaster risk reduction. And the New South Wales government, through the roles of the Reconstruction Authority and the Department of Communities and Justice, are really working toward putting those practice tools into place. So how did we get from an idea around disability inclusive disaster risk reduction to actual change and policy change? We did that through a knowledge to action co-production process, combining a process of co-production, active co-production, inquiring, synthesizing, and co-producing, while engaging in appreciative inquiry cycles with people, not just people with lived experience of disability, but service providers as well, and emergency service sector colleagues and government as well, to help combine that knowledge in useful ways. At the outcomes of this knowledge to action co-production process for our team really results in tools, and we like to say tools that everybody can use. We need a place for these tools to live. So I'd really encourage you guys to become familiar with Collaborating for Inclusion, which is the website where we put all those tools as we're co-designing them, when we're finished them, and as we make improvements to them over time. So you'll see that this website is actually quite dynamic and updated on a routine basis. And when you go to the website, you will find that there is a specific page and project dedicated to person-centered emergency preparedness, and a suite of resources that we'll talk a little bit about today. The other thing I wanted to just put into perspective before we take a deeper dive into person-centered emergency preparedness is to just think about this, I suppose, continuum of responsibility. Person-centered emergency preparedness planning really does need to start with each of us as individuals, understanding our risks, understanding what preparedness steps we need to take, matching our particular risk situation, but also our capabilities and our life situations to how we're going to manage in an emergency situation and in the long term of recovery. When there are residual risks, particularly for people with disability, people in the aged care sector, people with functional support needs, it is our organizations, and when I say organizations, I mean all of those organizations, community health, disability, social welfare, housing, et cetera, become an important part of our safety and our support network. And I think I want to spend some time really unpacking your role today as primarily, I think, on the line health and maybe community sector workers in the space. What role can you play at an organizational level? And how does that intersect with the individual level plans of the people that you support? And I suppose to think of that in complex ways, like what are the ways in which you first provide that support to people? And then what are the most logical ways that you might embed person-centered emergency planning to ensure continuity of services and supports, enabling and facilitating individuals to have a plan, maybe connecting and referring and linking people into other services and support to make sure that that plan is actually effective and practiced. On the far right of this diagram, we have the community. And so in our emergency services sector, our emergency services are required to have community level plans. We tend to think of those as our local government emergency plans. But you can also think of them as, I guess, regional or sector-wide plans that are going to support safety across a community. The two tools that I have listed on the slide, the person-centered emergency preparedness, starts at that individual level and works out toward understanding where are the gaps and what strategies can organizations put in place to support service continuity. And when there's residual gaps there, what plans can we put in place at that community or local government level to ensure that those risks are further mitigated and people and their support needs are managed during an emergency. We have two key approaches, the person-centered tool that we'll talk about today, and disability inclusive emergency planning. So I just wanted to raise DIEP as a community level intervention or strategy, if you will, that we use to bring all of these stakeholders together into community level conversations, to have often hard conversations about residual risks and structural barriers and challenges that people experience, but then working in partnership and together to break down those challenges. I won't talk anymore about DIEP today, but feel free to go back later, have a look at the Collaborating for Inclusion website, look at our DIEP approach to community level conversations, maybe dig a little deeper and see if a forum has happened in your community, and reach out to your local council and your emergency services to learn more about how you can link a bit more to the community level plans. So we'll come back to this idea of how you can support and enable and facilitate safe communities through your role as an organization, but we'll probably center most of our conversation today around that intersection between individuals and their safety and organizations and their preparedness. And in that process, it'll be really important for you to think about your staff, volunteers, as a key part of your organizational and service continuity planning. So we will focus today on planning with PSEP. That will sort of be central to our conversation. And Jenny's helped me with a poll at first. So I'll stop for a second and invite Jenny to launch that poll. I really want to know from your perspective, how prepared are you for an emergency? So if you think from, I haven't thought about it before, you're down at level 1, all the way through to I reviewed actions and told others, way up at level 5. And I really challenge you to be as genuine as you can in your response to this poll. So we could think about if you're up at level 5, you have an emergency kit for your home and your car and your work. You've got a plan where you've communicated it with everyone in your family. There's a place where you know you're going to meet up and reconnect. You've checked and reviewed that plan every 3 to 6 months, and you have regularly and routinely practiced it. So we mean like serious level 5 if you're putting yourself up there at level 5. And then you'll see 2, 3, and 4 in the middle. Thought about it, but not yet acted, started to get organized at number 3, and have taken some actions to get ready. I can't really see on my screen if that poll is launched. Jenny, are you able to let me know?
Yes, it is. 46% of people have voted. So if everyone could just quickly get on there and click on their selection, and then I can share the results.
Oh, excellent. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's probably good, Jenny, if you want to stop it there and
Sure.
see what we have.
Sure. Can you see them, Michelle?
No, I can't see anything on my screen, unfortunately.
Okay, so I'll just read it out to you. How prepared are you? Haven't thought about it was 4%. Thought about it but not yet acted, 33%. Started to get organised, 30%. Have taken actions to get ready, 26%. And reviewed actions and told others, 7%.
Thanks so much, Jenny. I appreciate that. And I think that's probably a fair reflection of what we see when we are, when we engage with people in these conversations to begin with. People tend to sit around number 2 or number 3. And what I hope is that by thinking about emergency preparedness today, you'll start to recognize the importance of it being a process, and that one of the skills that you can bring to your own preparedness and conversations with your families, but also to preparedness conversations with your staff and with your clients and across your organizations, is to start to think about making sure you match where people are at in terms of their preparedness level and where they need to get to. Because I often say it would be really unfair if you're the 33% at number 2, where you've thought about it, but you haven't taken actions. And then I was going to tell you that at the end of this 1-hour webinar, or by tomorrow morning at 8 a.m., you need to have this perfect emergency plan in place with all of the parts organized. That would be quite unfair and quite an impossible task to engage in. And I think sometimes when we think about awareness and emergency preparedness, we tend to think of these things as one-off conversations where we tell people what their risks are and we give them information. And that's quite typically and historically how our emergency services have operated, just giving community-wide information. Here's your risks and here's the tools to get prepared. But what we've been learning is how important it is to take preparedness as an ongoing process of reviewing and improving that process over time. And that, in fact, as part of that process, you're actually building psychological readiness and capability to manage in what is really an increasing and cascading impact of disasters we're experiencing here in Australia and other parts of the world as well. So what this really brings up is one of the key principles that the PCEP is built on is this idea of matching preparedness levels to a stage of preparedness. So all of you guys from the health sector will be very familiar with stages of change theory, and really we've applied that as one of the core underlying principles in the design of the PCEP toolkit. And so thinking about the reflective questions on the right as a way to think about matching your conversation with people as you begin to understand what steps have they or have they not yet taken, and beginning to match your expectations, I suppose, around preparedness and your kinds of facilitation and questioning about how to support and enable preparedness that's better matched to the level that people find themselves at. So those of you today can reflect on your quiz. It looks like we have the majority of people sitting at contemplation and preparation. And with any luck, we will have everyone at least at step 2, and maybe even by tomorrow, everyone could have taken one extra action to take one more step toward preparedness if they're not quite there yet. The other thing that I want to do before I dig too much more deeply into PCEP and other key principles behind that tool is to let you know about organizational emergency preparedness and the survey that we've developed. This is really targeting you, everyone across the health, the disability, social welfare, housing, you name it, any kind of service provider from the community. We've built this tool with you in mind. We've built it as a survey that's interactive, so you could click on that QR code and you could undertake the survey. The profile actually has 6 sections in it. One will just sort of profile who you are as an organization, your size, that sort of thing. Sections 2 and 3 are where I want to focus a bit of my attention, so I'll come back to those in a second. Another part of that profile will ask you about what you think the gaps and challenges are, and ask you about your preferences for sharing information about residual risks and other challenges for your organizations and emergencies. So we think about what do you want governments and emergency services to know? What kind of information do you need from them? There's a section that's tailored for you all about that. And then there's another section that asks you to reflect and think about what accessible resources you have within your organization, whether those are material resources or whether they're kind of intangible things like incredible knowledge and skills that your staff might have in your organization that could support accessibility and be mobilized in an emergency situation. When we co-designed this tool, the services that we co-designed with said, please add a section that helps us to talk also about our disaster experience. For many organizations, disaster experience, particularly in response and recovery, is increasing. And so there's that section 6 on the tool that invites you to share what your experiences are and some of the capabilities gained just by simply being involved in a disaster activation. But let me go back to sections 2 and 3 because that's relevant to today's conversation and it's relevant to the person-centered emergency preparedness toolkit. Section 2 is a part of the tool that's based on a decade of our research on the role, the capacity, the tools, and the training needs of service providers across these diverse range of service sectors in emergency planning and preparedness. And we've knocked that down into 9 key elements. So you'll find when you get to section 2, you'll be invited to reflect on 9 items in terms of, do you do all of these things already? Some of these things, you could do it in the future, or it's not relevant or not applicable to my organization. It's really important to think that through, and we've stepped it through in a really, hopefully a very helpful self-assessment way, starting with identifying service recipients who might be at risk in emergencies and moving all the way through to partnering and collaborating with other organizations or sister organizations where you might support and each other in an emergency situation and everything in between. So I'll encourage you guys to have a look at that survey, contemplate it and engage in that. And then in section 3, it really looks at that link between the continuity of services and supports that your organization can or may not be able to provide in an emergency, and the supports and resources that individuals may need in an emergency situation. So that links back to person-centered emergency preparedness. There are 8 items, again, that help you think through that whole process of enabling emergency preparedness with the people that you support. Again, using those same prompts. We do all of this already in our organization through to, we could do this in the future. One of the things that's exciting about this tool is you can, once you finish that survey online, you can actually download your responses and use that to support your organization to continue the preparedness conversation, and use it then to track any changes over time. So this might be the first time we've really had a tool that can help you put a bit of a barometer on where you're at now in your emergency preparedness and continuity of your organization, and how that links to the preparedness support you provide with clients or patients that you're providing services to, and to be able to track that over time. And we also provide some next steps and tips and strategies. However, when we were implementing this tool with providers, what was really exciting is the design, particularly of the section 2 and section 3, is it automatically provides a thinking tool. So if you've done all of these first 3 things, but the 4th thing is yet to get started, it automatically starts to break down that organizational preparedness process for you into bite-sized and manageable chunks. So I just wanted to welcome you to engage with the survey tool. Tell anyone you like about the survey. We're hoping to engage in a nationwide capture of the preparedness levels across Australia of diverse organizations. So feel free to use it yourself and share that with other people. The other thing I wanted to share, because we will run out of time and there's probably too many things for me to tell you about PCEP. So up front, I wanted to make sure that you put these 4 key PCEP tools in your toolkit. And Ellen tells me later that she'll also share these slides and make them available so you can follow up on any of the links and the QR codes later. But I wanted to point out that some of the key things people think are the best part of PCEP, and maybe that's true, are the PCEP workbook. But the PCEP workbook isn't necessarily the only tool, or maybe not always the best tool for a busy healthcare provider or a general practitioner or someone who might be seeing someone frequently but for very short periods of time. So you may find actually that the capability wheel, just a 1-page capability wheel, is a useful tool, or a poster that you can put up in your waiting room or office. You can't unsee it when you start reading the questions that are on the PCEP poster. So it automatically, as people are just waiting for appointments, can start working their way through the PCEP process in just a 1A3 sized poster that can sit on your wall. And similarly, there is the A5 card, which is a nice little you could print those out and people can take that away, and it encourages them to just pick up a pen and engage a little bit with that planning process. And both of those tools will link people back to videos and resources and other information to help them elaborate their plan in a lot more detail. So I encourage you to think about that as part of your toolkit and a way to get started with your patients and your clients in practice. So now the toolkit itself, what is the PSAP? It's really a process tool and framework. So it's got these three parts: a capability framework, principles, there's 3 principles, and there's 4 steps. I'll spend a bit of time on that capability framework, and I'll come back to that a couple times over in the next little bit. So the capability framework, the top 3 elements on that framework are listed as living situation, social connectedness, and transportation. They're there because those are things we all need to think about before, during, and after emergency. People standing next to us will be our first responders, so we need to be thinking about how connected or not we are to the people around us and who's going to be able to be there to support us in emergencies. Transportation is obviously a critical factor, especially if you're evacuating to a place of safety and needing a way to transport away from danger, or needing a way to transport goods and services, or maybe people and support services to your home that might be cut off in a particular disaster like a flood. And living situation, which refers in a quite a dynamic way to the safety of the community, the risks in the community, but also how you take care of your household and manage the risks in your local community. So those 3 things are the key things we all need to think about. The other elements, the other 5 elements on the capability wheel, are the additional elements that we co-designed using that knowledge to action process, where we looked at the literature and we consulted. In fact, the Hunter New England Health was a key part of the original design of this capability framework back in 2017. So kudos to Hunter New England Health. We made sure that we were also matching the additional support needs that people with disability have, or people with other functional support needs in emergencies, and helping to break that process down. So you'll see assistance animals, communication, personal support, management of health, and assistive technology. Those are the critical parts of the capability framework, and we welcome people to literally engage with it as a placemat with a cup of tea and a conversation, and starting that conversation with what do I do, where do I do it, and who do I do it with, and what, if any, of these elements are relevant to my life. How do I get, give, and receive support? And how do these elements have a role in my everyday life? And using that as a starting point for a person-centered emergency preparedness conversation. And I'll come back to this idea of not jumping ahead to the plan before you've done the job of first thinking about what are your strengths and support needs in everyday life. So that's the capability framework. In short, we call it the capability wheel quite often. It's the PSAP framework or the capability wheel, but we call it the capability wheel because it's really, it's all about what are the opportunities we have to exercise those opportunities in our everyday life, to be connected to people and to be safe and to go about our activities, and then how we manage that in an emergency situation. So focusing from a position of our capabilities or strengths, and recognizing that it's also about the opportunities and potential barriers for people in emergencies. And I think that's where our role as providers becomes really critical. The principles become really important. All of our colleagues in Western Australia have actually created fridge magnets to remind the emergency services sector that emergency preparedness is a process, not a one-time event, because they will tell me on a frequent basis that that's one of the things that they often rush through, jumping ahead, telling people about their risk, telling them they need a plan, but not always recognizing that it can be a process that needs to be negotiated with a number of stakeholders, that can take a while to get things in place, and where gaps can persist that keep people at disproportionate risk when they're not dealt with. So this really critical thing of thinking of preparedness as a process, which we did in that initial exercise together today. And number 2, making sure to recognize that people are the experts in their lives and that planning starts with them. I'll come back to that one with a little story to illustrate that in a health care setting. The third principle is that person-centered planning conversations actually build capability of multiple stakeholders toward inclusive disaster risk reduction, or DIDRR. And I want to be really clear. I think when these standards, for example, in the disability sector were first introduced in 2021, I think the first reaction of the disability sector was a bit alarm, like, oh my goodness, there's one more thing we have to do and add on top of our work. If there's anything that I would love for you to take away from today's conversation, is that this is not about adding to your work, it's about embedding preparedness conversations into your practices as they exist. And a key part of PSEP is making sure that we're all doing that. Every different stakeholder, from government emergency services to individuals themselves and the services that support us, are all having our piece of that puzzle, if you will, part of that conversation, and that we're embedding it into what we do, not creating it as another additional task on top. So we'll come back to that idea as well. Then as a process tool, the PSEP is really about taking these 4 steps and really recognizing the importance of these 4 steps in order. So the first step, step 1, is about that, taking that capability wheel and really taking that time to just reflect on strengths and support needs in everyday life. That became really critical for us when we were field testing and in the long-term rollout of this tool across multiple different groups of people with different functional support needs. For example, we were working with St. Vincent de Paul's, who were doing a bushfire recovery project up in the Kempsey region. And they were working through the PSEP, having learned the PSEP approach and starting to make personalized plans with about 40 or 50 people who had been displaced and then were reintegrating back home after the bushfires. And they found that this one client they had, George, they were really struggling to get moving beyond step 1. And that was, and it was really perplexing for the St. Vincent de Paul's workers who weren't healthcare workers and didn't really understand why it was so hard for them to move beyond the challenges that George was experiencing in his everyday life. So we actually went out and I encouraged them to invite the community care nurse along. And this is George's care coordinator in the community. And it turned out that that care coordinator, thanks to COVID and some bushfires, hadn't actually followed up or seen George in a while. And when she came to do a joint visit with those Vinnie's workers, talking about emergency preparedness necessarily meant talking about how George was coping and managing every day. And it meant revisiting his aged care plan. It meant a visit to his geriatrician and scheduling a specialist appointment. It meant some pretty significant changes to make sure that he was supported every day before being able to move on. So I thought it was just a great example of how someone facilitating PSEP from the community service perspective needs then to connect their clients or individuals into their healthcare support services. In this case, their aged care service, to make sure they had the right aged care package, to make sure they had the right levels of support in place, particularly following George's significant period of decline, not to mention the impact of the disaster on his physical declines too. The other parts of the step we'll go through in order. We'll talk about your role at step 2, 3, and 4 as part of the process, but really want to heavily recommend the critical importance of step 1 and have you think about, particularly those of you who are working in the healthcare sector, looking around that capability wheel and thinking about the kinds of questions you already ask, you already engage in with your clients that are already part of your intake assessments or tools in one way or another, and how do you already build that bank of information, if you will, about the strengths and the support needs that people have in everyday life as a starting point, because our healthcare providers actually become a critical community resource just because you have such trusted and deep understanding of people's function-based support needs in the everyday. And that's a critical foundation point to making sure people are safe when disasters happen. I did want to highlight that in one of those handouts, one of the links at the early slide where I said this is going to be part of your toolkit, we actually have a how to be a person-centered conversation partner, kind of a handy guide. And it just reminds us to take our time, remember it as a journey, and to be a role model, provide some structure to that conversation, to be curious and focus on the journey, and make sure that you're recognizing that emergency planning conversations can be really hard. And in fact, not having them is riskier than having them. So it is important to start the conversation and not protect people from that conversation, but also recognize the importance that it can be a really empowering a point of mental preparedness for emergencies as well. So that handout will elaborate a little bit more on your role at each of these stages. That first one being really critical. We probably don't have any authority to start facilitating preparedness plans or telling other people how to get prepared until we have increased our own preparedness ourselves. So I would be the biggest advocate for you individually and with your families and households taking that time to increase your emergency preparedness before jumping into preparing others. So we've talked a lot about step one. I probably don't have to hammer that point, but just to remind people that your job at step one is to start with the everyday. Use the capability wheel as a prompt for that conversation. Start from a foundation of strength and not fear. I'll just give you an illustration of that point. When we did some initial consultations across Australia about how providers are engaging in conversations, we found that they tended to have those conversations when a disaster was imminent. So when we're already quite stressed that something is going to happen in our community and there's not enough time to prepare. And that with those conversations, they tended to kind of quiz or prompt people through questions. You know, what will you do if? How are you going to manage if? These what if questions. So starting from a position of the emergency is close and now I'm going to stress you out with a lot of questions that are really hard to answer is probably not the most helpful way to engage people in starting with strengths rather than fear. So really thinking about how can you embed these conversations really early when there's not an imminent disaster and when we can actually start with the strengths that people are bringing to that conversation and to their lives. Because we've learned clearly, and you will know from your interactions with clients, even people with some of the most significant challenges know how to manage some of the most confronting and inaccessible environments. So they've got the best solutions to the challenges. So when we start from this position of how they manage every day and how they can cope, then that really starts to position people for taking charge of their own preparedness plan and being in the driver's seat of that. I wanted to just point out really quickly that when we were doing this work initially, we also were doing just having service providers of all kinds. This is a healthcare provider's example that's on the screen here, just to get an idea of how people were managing this in the first instance as we were building the PCEP tool. We quite often found that forms looked a lot like this. And the practices looked a lot like the service provider holding the clipboard or the iPad, the information all being kind of on that form and it being kind of yes, no questions and answers. And so we found that was essentially a barrier to preparedness. It created a situation where people didn't understand why they were having the conversation in the first place. But more importantly, it left people with the impression that their service provider was making the plan for them. And then it set up a situation where people assumed that someone would have their back in an emergency situation. And you will know, of course, being providers, that you will be contending not just with one client, but many clients or your whole organization and the people that you support. And for some of us in an emergency situation, having just to manage our own families and risk situation. So it's really important that we're not leaving any individual with the idea that we have the plan in place for them, that the plan actually comes from them. So I'd really encourage you to think about the tools you use and how those tools either focus on vulnerability, as the title is of this particular tool, and risk assessment versus sort of capability and enabling preparedness planning. Here's another example of personal safety. And when we were doing some field work around this, again, it feels like it's a bit of a quiz. Are you aware of the disasters in your area? And then, who knows what the conversation follows from that. And I think that brings us rapidly to what we'll talk about next in step 2. Like, what if you're not yourself as a service provider not familiar with risks or risk management, but you're actually asking these questions. It can feel really confronting for service providers to start a conversation when you're not in the full know and understanding of that. And that's essentially why the PSEP 4 steps become really important, because it's a learning journey for service providers as well. And you're not expected to know everything or how to read meteorological charts or figure out exactly how to respond. It's part of a process of you learning to do that alongside people in your organization. But just as a point of interest, when we did an audit with a group of service providers who were using forms like this, in every situation, the name of the emergency contact was incorrect. And I think that that's just a bit of a gulp moment for all of us. 6 months or a year goes by and you do your personal safety or your risk assessment again, and you find out that the name of the contact was a family member who passed away, a neighbor who's moved away, or any other combination. And this was the case when we did this with service providers. So I think, again, thinking that there's an emergency contact and we'll just contact them is also puts us in a risky situation of how to manage and navigate that. So at step 1, we've talked already about the capability tool. I want to draw your attention just to this original user guide, which is on the screen. That's on our, if you go to the New South Wales page on our site, and you'll find that was the original user guide, originally designed with service providers in mind. And I thought I'd pull it out and just show you the face of that tool today, because you might actually find that really helpful to you when thinking about probing questions or strategies that are inside that toolkit. I wanted to briefly clarify your role at step 2. Your job is not to know everything about disasters. Your job is to connect people to information and people who have that knowledge and information and make those links. I love the program that Fire and Rescue in New South Wales has that deals with falls management, for example. They have a partnership with the health sector so that if someone's going in from the Fire and Emergency Services to do a smoke alarm testing and they notice someone is at risk of falls, they can make a referral to health. If someone from health is seeing a client and they recognize they don't have a working smoke alarm, they can make a referral to Fire and Emergency Services. I think that's a simple but a very useful example of the ways that you might people in to emergency services and people, our fireys in particular, or our state emergency services who have flood and storm information that can help connect people in to what they need to know. And it goes two ways. You can help those services and those organizations begin to understand the risks that your clients face and help them to understand what they might need. So in our person-centered emergency preparedness workbook, it will sort of break that process down a little bit for you too, and think of it as your own personal journey, beginning to understand your local risks and where to get information and alerts for yourself, and then beginning to expand that out to the people that you support. And I think one of the other skills that we bring in this space as health and community care providers is recognizing when that information is not particularly accessible and thinking about the different ways that you might be able to help link people into information in ways that are more accessible and useful to them, depending on your particular expertise and skill set. So anyone in speech pathology, I'm looking at you in terms of communication or alternate communication forms. There's some pretty definite skills that other service providers can really bring to these conversations to make sure that it links really effectively for people. At step 2, we also want to remind you to keep bringing it back to the capability wheel so people can keep thinking, well, how will that emergency impact you? So we really need to personalize that risk information and keep it real and relevant for people. At step 3 of the process, we're now really getting into the make a plan process. And we have broken it down into, well, there's two ways to think about this. You're either making a plan to stay or you're making a plan to go. And I suppose there might be also a go fast situation. And those of you who are working with people, particularly who are bedridden or homebound or immunocompromised and may be spending long periods of time in their home situation, you probably also want to make sure you're doing due diligence to ensure that they have working smoke alarms and safe exits and part of that process, and perhaps inviting fire and emergency services along to help you do a home safety scan as part of that process. And occupational therapists, I'm looking at you. You guys can probably play a critical role here in looking at environments and environmental safety for people. because it actually is in house fires where older people and people with disability are more likely to die in those situations. And so thinking about what our responsibilities can be long before that. The other thing I wanted to say about step 3 is that this is the part where our colleagues with disability will say, Michelle, it's so anticlimactic. By the time you get to step 3, it all kind of makes sense. And that's what we love about a process tool. If you actually spend the time at step 1 and 2, then step 3 becomes so obvious what your actions need to be. And yet I think it is what people really benefit from is that brainstorming process. So having another human to have conversations and reflect out loud about, I will have trouble going because in an evacuation, these things will be a problem for me. Or I have trouble sheltering in place because these things will be a challenge for me. And what it does is it takes that information and instead of keeping it in a place of fear, starts to put those challenges and barriers on the table and enables a bit of a problem-solving process around how to manage them. So step 3 is really all about helping to make it fit and coming back to the capability wheel to think about priorities. Another thing that's really critical to think about in this space is to recognize that it is about breaking it down. So I like to use the example of our colleague John, who helped us in the early days of the design of this tool. He has a high-level spinal injury, and those 3 circled items, living situation, assistive technology, and management of health, are not his only priorities in an emergency, but they're his top priorities. So although there are other things for him to focus on, he's picked and broken down these 3 things to focus on. And he did it initially because he needed some low-hanging fruit. Management of health was one of those things. He needed to make sure his scripts were always going to be available. If the pharmacy went under with his house, he's in a flood zone. So he was able to quickly digitize and make sure access to scripts was taken care of. For assistive technology, he really focused not on all of the things that he uses for his assistive technology, and he has a lot, but he actually focused on his priority, which was making sure he'd have an alternating air mattress functioning and set up, whether he needed to shelter in place without power or whether he needed to evacuate somewhere else without an air mattress, because he knew that having a pressure sore was going to be the biggest risk to his health, and everything else would fall into place if he could just settle on the air mattress as part of his preparedness plan. And then in his living situation, he focused quite heavily on evacuation from his house in a house fire, living with his elderly mom, who also had a disability and was a bit forgetful, with his bedroom right off of the kitchen and only one accessible exit well on the other side of that kitchen. That became a priority for John to think about and problem solve how he was going to manage an evacuation from his house. So quickly at step 4, I just want to talk about the importance of step 4 is really about communicating the plan with people in your support network and addressing gaps through collaboration. So what does that mean for us as service providers? It means that we need to be an advocate. We need to connect people to information, knowledge, and resources. We need to step up when there are gaps, and we need to talk about it and raise awareness about it. And going back to that organizational emergency profile, that's one way that you can start that self-assessment process and becoming that advocate for the people that you support. People often ask us, what does a plan look like? We will say and maintain that people love to document their plan, but really the best plan is the one that's been practiced and that is so intuitive. You know how it will work without needing the document. But there are many different ways that people might choose to document that plan. And we've been co-designing with people with disability My PSEP plan, which is yet another tool. We're on another leg of giving us a trial with older people in Queensland this year to see how we might strengthen this tool. But essentially, if you follow that link later, you'll see that it provides a bit of a self-assessment and checking process around your own person-centered plan across those 4 PSEP steps. And in fact, you could use it yourself to check on your plan and your progress with your own personal plan. So I think I'll just skip by this slide to just say that really it's just about making sure that you as provider are recognizing unmet needs and gaps and making sure that you're advocating for them in your community. And so a big part of your role in this is getting connected with emergency services, with government, within your organization to the person who is perhaps responsible for your emergency plan. So think about where PSEP could fit with what you already do within your role and your capabilities within your organization, I think is a critical starting point. I'm going to wind down from there, but I just wanted to make sure I leave you with some key resources to let you know that we have a person-centered emergency preparedness certificate course at the University of Sydney, a really strong evaluation demonstrating its effectiveness in helping prepare us first, as well as giving us the capabilities to enable and prepare others. So if you follow the links on the website, you can actually have a look at the course evaluation and findings, and you can learn more information if you are interested in taking the full PSEP course or with a cohort of people enrolling in PSEP. We have another cohort starting in May. And I think the unique thing about this PSEP course really is just that it brings diverse stakeholders together. You'll be learning alongside people with disability, services that support them, government and emergency services. And to our knowledge, it's the only interdisciplinary course in the world that really brings people together in this kind of problem-based learning space in a really productive way to think about how we can all take our share of the responsibility and break it down to make it more readily available to all of us. Also wanted to highlight that we are working on research that's about disability sector leadership in this space, and our champions, not just in Queensland, but I have to shout out to Queenslanders with Disability Network as amazing champions in this space, and their team of peer leaders who you can see across these images, and their emerging leaders who are increasingly involved in this space, who are leading the charge. And it means that there's another whole group of people in your local communities who are ready and able and aware and prepared themselves with disability and ready to have those conversations one-on-one with people who might feel more comfortable having a deep conversation about tips and strategies for preparedness with someone else who has similar support needs. And I also wanted to shout out to our emergency sector who've been doing some amazing work in this space. You have really strong allies across our government and emergency services in using the PSEP tools. So if you're feeling like the hot potato has been passed to you, you can actually reach out and start collaborating with any of your emergency services, and they'll be pretty game to get involved with you. Similarly, there are a number of service providers, and I think on the call today, we might even have some PSEP facilitators working for various organizations who you might even be able to refer to help continue and deepen an emergency preparedness plan. So just really to finish, the key points I'd like you to take away is that it really is about shifting our perspective from thinking of people as vulnerable to capable. The vulnerability approach doesn't work, but if we make sure we understand that people with disability are quite capable of putting preparedness in their own hands, and we give them the right tools to do it, they're quite capable and empowered to make those plans. The tools we use matter. So when we build empowerment into the tools that we use, we get empowerment out of that process. And I think the images on the screen sort of demonstrate this more equitable approach to people learning from, with, and about emergency services and people with disability together about how they might enable preparedness and build that into the tools. When we started this work, we thought we were just preparing people with disability to be empowered, but we are clearly empowering our emergency sector too. And how we use tools really matters. So the capability wheel has really shown that we can put person-centered planning into the hands of individuals and let them lead and be in the driver's seat. So putting the capability wheel literally in their hands and supporting them to make their plan is probably the best step forward for you. And I'll stop there by saying feel free to reach out, visit our website, contact us, and ask any questions that you like.
Thanks so much, Michelle. That was a great presentation. We haven't had any questions come through yet. I did just put in the chat that a copy of Michelle's presentation will also be available in our library, so that you will have all of those resources available for you. I think you've just covered everything so well that they haven't got anything to ask. Ellen, did you want to say anything else?
No, I just wanted to thank everyone for joining today's webinar and for your time during this lunchtime learning event. And thank you so much, Michelle, for coming and presenting to us, and for giving us an overview. It's definitely a concept everyone can build items out of it into their daily undertakings to make sure that we are better prepared, we have a better prepared client base. I see a few people popping up now. There might be questions.
Yes, so I think Sarah had her hand up. Did you want to ask a question, Sarah?
Just wanted to say thank you. I work in disability services, but also been a volunteer with the SES for 25 years. So it was really interesting for me to listen. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. And just FYI, New South Wales SES have just embedded our emergency sector disability awareness training into their induction program. So shout out to
Excellent.
SES in New South Wales. It's really great. Yeah.
Yeah, good, good.
Yeah.
All right. Nobody else had anything else to add? Thanks very much, and thank you everyone for attending, and we'll see you all next time.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.